This is Midnight Sun. Almost since we were born, since we could understand the words of our parents and our teachers at school, we were told that we were independent individuals. Somehow, socially, we were instilled with a series of ideas, of attitudes that we could describe as selfish, based on the individual as something separate from the rest of the universe. We were told phrases like, "It is not your problem, care only about yourself." Sometimes we were even told, "Hit before you get hit," or "Look after yourself and forget about others." Maybe they even told us sayings like, "Every man for himself." And all this was undoubtedly worsened with the advent of neoliberal capitalism over the last 40 years, where the concept of individualism, together with that of competition, has been taken to paroxysm. Well, all this is part of a worldview, the prevailing worldview in Western countries, which is the modernist worldview, based on analysis, on getting to the ultimate elements of reality. That worldview that has brought about climate change, the mass extinction of species, that savage capitalism that is neoliberalism, that same worldview that is plunging the countries of the global south into extreme poverty, that worldview that has brought us materialism. What if you were told now that we are not independent but interdependent individuals, that we are all connected to each other and that we are all in the same boat? What if you were told that your destiny is linked to the destiny of all those around you? Not only that your destiny is linked to the destiny of all beings that populate this planet. I suppose that this would change your vision of reality, and with it would also change your life, your way of being in the world. Today we are going to do the second part of the program we started with episode 2, entitled "Tell me how you see the world and I tell you what you have done with it." And this second part will be subtitled "Interdependencies." If you think that this program does not apply to you, you might be wrong, as it could make a big difference in your personal life. So, welcome to all of you, whatever you think, whatever your ideas, because if you follow us in this program, in the end, you are going to see the world in a very different way.
Midnight Sun, directed by Grain Kutanda.
Welcome to Midnight Sun. If you are listening to us, please feel yourself as part of the tribe. As I said, today we are going to talk about interdependencies. In the second part of the series, tell me how you see the world and I will tell you what you have done with it. But in order to talk about interdependencies, perhaps the first thing to do is to define this concept. Cambridge Dictionary defines interdependence as the fact of depending on each other, while the Collins Dictionary says that interdependence is the condition of a group of people or things that all depend on each other. We have spoken to you here many times about the Earth Charter. You know, it is an international document, the most inclusive document ever produced so far, which deals with the ethical principles that should underpin humanity's relationship with planet Earth throughout the 21st century. Well, the Earth Charter uses the word interdependence 4 times, no less, perhaps because it is an important concept. In fact, the word interdependence appears in the second sentence of the Earth Charter, right at the opening. It also appears right before the beginning of the list of principles, where it says, "Therefore, together in hope we affirm the following interdependent principles for a sustainable way of life." But perhaps the most important point where the Earth Charter uses the word interdependence is in Principle 1a, right after the call to respect the Earth and life in all its diversity. Principle 1a calls for recognize that all beings are interdependent and every form of life has value regardless of its worth to human beings. Finally, in the epilogue of the Earth Charter, in the second paragraph, the word interdependence reappears when it says, "This, it refers to the process of change that we'll have to carry on in order to build a sustainable civilization. This requires a change of mind and heart. It requires a new sense of global interdependence and universal responsibility." This is why the concept of interdependence is so important for us to build a sustainable civilization and a civilization that respects life and the earth, a civilization that is much more just, both socially and economically. Do you know the Earth Charter? The Earth Charter is an international declaration of ethical principles for the respect and care of life, ecological integrity, social and economic justice, democracy, non-violence and peace. But it is also a worldwide movement which seeks to inspire in all people a new sense of global interdependence and share responsibility for the well-being of the whole human family, the community of life and future generations, thus becoming a vision of hope and a call to action. Learn more about the Earth Charter at earthcharter.org. Earth Charter, turning conscience into action. Tell me how you see the world and I will tell you what have you done with it. Part 2. Today we are talking about interdependencies. but to understand what interdependencies are, to really see how far this concept is so necessary to build an earth-friendly civilization, to really see how far this concept goes, we will first have to see what interconnections are, because without interconnections, there are no interdependencies. And what better than a story? What better than a tale, a myth, to understand what interconnections are? Specifically, I am referring to a story entitled Indra's Net, a story that belongs to the Indian Buddhist tradition and goes as follows. One night, at the end of one of the Vasa retreats, in the Jetavana Park, in Sravasti, one of the followers of Buddha asked him, "Master, what is the ultimate foundation of life and the world?" Siddhartha Gautama raised his eyes to the sky and contemplated the stars. Then he smiled, as if remembering. The ultimate foundation of life and the world is the Net of Indra, god of the natural forces that protect and nourish life, he finally said, lowering his eyes to look with affection at his disciple. Indra established the foundations of the world in the Tushita heaven. To do this, he hung over his palace on Mount Meru a net of silk threads, like a spider web which extends to infinity in all directions. In each knot of the net he put a precious gem, which reflects in its perfect facets all the other gems that cover the net. When you approach to look into any one of those gems, you discover that the gems reflected in it reflect in turn each and every one of the other gems in this immense silk fabric, and so on to infinity. "I don't understand, Master," said the disciple, frowning. "Where are all those gems you are talking about? I do not see them in this world." "You are one of those gems," Buddha replied. "And every person, every animal, every tree and plant, every insect, every speck of dust that floats up into a sunbeam and down onto a road is a gem of the Net of Indra. Every emotion that you feel and all the feelings that all beings have ever felt, even thousands of years ago, and every idea that has crossed the mind of each being since the beginning of time, is a gem of Indra's net. Within you is reflected everything that exists and everything that has ever existed in the universe, and you, yourself, are reflected in everything that exists. You are inside each human being, each animal, tree and plant, each speck of dust, each idea or thought, each feeling to infinity. At every moment, the whole world is within you, and you are inside everything that exists. Although in your mind you see yourself as an independent being, and you feel separated from the rest of the world, in truth you are part of the common existence of everything that has ever been. You could never exist by virtue of yourself, by yourself alone, because you exist by virtue of the glorious existence of everything around you. A tear appeared in the eye of the disciple, and all the stars in the sky were reflected in it, as if in a gem. And Gautama Buddha added, with a look that seemed to caress the soul of the disciple, "That is why I say to all of you to take care of the happiness of everything that surrounds you, of all beings, whether you believe that they live and feel or not. because they have their existence also in the depths of your heart. You can find this story in the Earth Stories collection. You can find the link in the description, in the credits of this episode of Midnight Sun. This description of systems, which we find in a traditional story of Indian Buddhism, has been confirmed by today's Western science through systems theories and the theory of complexity. It can be surprising that through the intuitive knowledge that comes from these ancient spiritual traditions, they could come to the same conclusions that we have come to only in the last century, as I say, through systems theories and the theory of complexity. But how do we see the interconnections of Indra's network? How do we see the invisible threads that link us to everything in the universe? Well, that is what we'll talk about in the next program. We will talk about imagination, which is the only way to see the interconnections, seeing with both eyes, the physical eye and the imaginative eye. You know, the reviled imagination, mistreated by that materialistic worldview, which treats it as a simple and vulgar fantasy. In the next program, we will talk about the importance of imagination in order to develop a systemic thinking and a complex systems worldview. If everything is interconnected with everything, as current science is saying, everything will depend on everything else in the universe. This is the interdependence. Somehow, our destiny is linked to the destiny of all the other beings that populate our planet. Not only that, our destiny is linked to the destiny of everything that exists, whether it has life or not only on Earth, but in the universe. In short, on Earth, all beings are in the same boat, and we depend on each other. We cannot think that humanity will survive if the rest of the species disappear, as hundreds of species are already disappearing on a massive scale every day. We are all in the same boat. And we have clear examples of these interconnections and interdependencies. We have a couple of examples that can serve very well to illustrate the interdependencies. These are two historical events. The first of these is the extermination of sparrows that took place in China during the time of Mao Zedong, between 1958 and 1960. It was during the Four Pest campaign, in which they tried to massively eliminate mice, flies, mosquitoes and sparrows as part of a project they called the Great Leap Forward. This was intended to increase grain production. As a justification, Chinese government propaganda claimed that each sparrow ate, on average, 4 pounds of grain per year, concluding that if we kill all the sparrows, there will be more food for humans. This was more or less the rationale. Mao Zedong went so far as to say, "Sparrows are one of the worst pests. They are enemies of the revolution. They eat our crops. Kill them. No warrior will retire until they are eradicated. We must endure with the stubbornness of a revolutionary." Indeed, one of the Mao's aphorisms was, "Man must defeat nature." As we see, modernism not only crystallized in capitalism, it also crystallized in communism. The same worldview expressed in its two extremes, but the same worldview, after all, that has brought us to the climate and extinction crisis we are living through. The Four Pest campaign led to the poisoning of millions of sparrows in China, but the extinction of the sparrows brought a short-term problem, A series of locust infestations that ruined successive crops, losing far more grain than they thought they could save by exterminating sparrows. This, along with floods and drought, brought one of the greatest famines ever suffered by the Asian country, the Great Chinese Famine, which took place between 1959 and 1961, one of the greatest man-made disasters. According to various estimates, between 15 and 55 million people died during the Great Famine. Eventually, the Chinese government had to admit its mistake and they were forced to import sparrows from the Soviet Union. 200,000 sparrows to be specific, although, of course, this was done secretly. How to admit, after causing so many millions of deaths, that the great leader had caused such a serious and tragic disaster? Subsequently, in 2001, China declared the sparrow a protected species. Even today, however, the sparrow population has still not recovered in the great Asian country. The second example illustrating the importance of interdependencies is the wolf extermination in Yellowstone National Park in the United States. Well, this is a case of which there are quite a few videos made and you can find them on the internet. But we can quickly tell you here what happened when in 1926 the last wolf was shot in Yellowstone. Humans promised themselves to be very happy when they shot the last one of these species, but it didn't take long for them to see the consequences of that terrible mistake. With the wolves extinct, elk and deer began to breed out of control, devouring the tender shoots of willow, poplar, and maple trees. This caused a profound imbalance in Yellowstone's forest population, which was worsened when other herbivores, also free from the stalking of the large predator, began to ravage the blueberry, gooseberry, clover, and dandelion populations. Eventually, the herbaceous cover of the region was compromised. With fewer flowers, the insect population also began to decline, and with it, the population of birds and small mammals also declined significantly, thus affecting the survival of foxes, badgers, weasels, and raptors. In addition, the rapid decline of the willow population resulted in a drastic drop in the beaver population in the area, as they were left without their main winter food. And what happened when beavers were driven to the brink of extinction in Yellowstone? It happened that rivers, no longer contained by beaver dams, became wider and shallower. Meanders disappeared and fertile soil was washed away. The soil that was no longer held by the roots of trees, grasses, and other plants, the soil that vegetation no longer held, flowed into the rivers, which, as they widened and became shallower, caused the flow to warm. And with the warming of the river waters came the decrease in the salmon population, which needed cold water to reproduce. Look at how a cascade of disaster is generated by the extinction of a species. Look at how interdependencies between species and individuals act on species. Finally, in 1995, almost 70 years after the disappearance of the wolf, and seeing that the entire Yellowstone ecosystem was collapsing, a scientist introduced into the area 31 wolf specimens brought from Canada. From that moment on, herbivores began to avoid open areas, so watercourses and riverbanks began to regenerate. grasses began to thrive again, dandelions began to grow again, flowers and seeds returned, and with them, insects began to regenerate, which in turn provided food for the regeneration of birds and small mammals, and with them, their predators, foxes, badgers, and raptors. Herbivores migrated again, leaving behind the sedentary lifestyle that the lack of wolves had caused, strengthening the species in the process, and the forest regenerated with more poplars, maples, and willows, with more blueberries and gooseberries, and with the willows, the beavers were also regenerated and returned to damming the rivers. With the dams, the rivers slowed down and regained their meandering flow. The waters cooled, and fish, amphibians, otters, and dragonflies were restored. And as the water flowed more slowly, aquifers throughout the region were recharged. In short, the reintroduction of the wolf and other species wiped out by man, such as bears and cougars, allowed the entire ecosystem to regulate itself again, to the point that the Yellowstone region is now almost as it was before the wolves were exterminated in 1926. This is what is meant by the interdependence of all beings and elements of nature on Earth. This is what we mean when we talk about the importance of interdependencies. It is this interdependence between all the components of a system that forms the deep structure of all open systems, be they natural, chemical, physical, biological, social, cultural, or any other kind of system. They are all systems nested within systems, for all systems, or of whatever kind, function in much the same way. And the same thing that happens in natural systems, as we have seen happened in Yellowstone, also happens in social systems. If large imbalances are generated, then social systems also deteriorate and end up collapsing. That is the great threat of our time, the threat of the collapse of our civilization. Something we can still avoid, and that is what we are going to talk about next.
Midnight Sun is a radio program that seeks to foster the process of social transformation needed to address the social, climate, and extinction emergency we are now entering. Our goal, that you put your talents at the service of the Earth and the terrestrial community of life. Join the tribe at the Midnight Sun, the social media hub of the Rainbow Warriors 3.5 global campaign. According to leading social science research, we need 3.5% of the world's population to put their talents into action if we are to mitigate the effects of the climate and extinction emergency we are facing. And that is the aim of this radio space. Midnight Sun is the communication hub of the Rainbow Warriors 3.5 global campaign.
Midnight Sun, if you are listening, consider yourself part of the tribe of all colors of Rainbow Warriors 3.5. We have seen what happens with ecosystems, what happens with interdependencies, the importance of interdependencies in natural systems. Now we are going to look at what happens, also briefly, because we can go on too long, but we are also going to look at what happens with social systems. And we are going to see it with what we in the social sciences have called neoliberalism. That neoliberal capitalist ideology that claimed that capitalism would determine all social processes, and not only the economy, but even the functioning of democracies, even at the expense of government. Neoliberalism began in 1973, when it was put to the test in the laboratory of Augusto Pinochet's dictatorship in Chile. It was there that this savage capitalism, as many scholars have called it, was born. Subsequently, after being put to the test in Chile, the neoliberal design of societies would be applied at the level of the great powers, as was the case in the UK and the States, with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, who in the 1980s introduced it in their countries and exported it to the entire Western world, and shortly afterwards to the entire planet. Neoliberalism is based on the same modernist worldview as previous capitalism, but taken to the extreme. The same modernist worldview that has brought us the climate and extinction crisis in which we find ourselves. Well, neoliberalism has two fundamental principles: competition at all costs and the most unbridled individualism. These two principles come from what has been called social Darwinism, a pseudo-scientific assumption that society would function in the same way as natural systems. So far, so good. The problem came when the survival of the fittest was interpreted in capitalist terms by the economic power elites. According to this approach, survival of the fittest would apply to sociology, economics, and politics, and would serve as a pretext to justify social inequalities, unfair distribution of wealth, and even some genocides, such as the Armenian genocide or the genocides carried out by Nazi Germany. In a way, social Darwinism was the pseudo-scientific foundation of many of the most socially and economically unjust approaches applied during the 20th and 21st centuries. And I say pseudo-scientific basis because in the end, the alleged scientific explanations were biased. At first it was thought that the so-called natural selection worked exclusively by the law of competition. It was competition in which the fittest was the only one with the right to survive. This, applied sociologically in the crudest way, justified the unjust and unequal distribution of wealth by putting the rich elites on the side of the fittest in the human species. However, the science has already shown that things are not exactly like that they are not exactly as the philosophers of social Darwinism wanted to interpret them, for it has been shown that there is more likelihood of survival in species through collaboration and cooperation than through competition. There is much more cooperation than competition in evolutionary processes. In any case, neoliberalism used social Darwinism as a pseudo-scientific justification for the abuses and inequalities that big capital breeds in today's societies. According to the neoliberal one-track thinking, each person is the sole and exclusive responsible for their economic and social situation. Society, the economic system, and the prevailing power structures are not to blame for the poverty, marginalization, and precariousness of a large part of the population. In a sense, the neoliberal one-track thinking is saying, don't blame society for your troubles. Your problems are exclusively yours, and you have brought them on yourself. This approach, individualistic to the extreme, lacking of a systemic understanding of interdependencies, was underlined by Margaret Thatcher when she stated, "There is no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families." In other words, everything is individualism, pure and simple. There is no such thing as society. That was the approach, that is still the approach of neoliberalism, which still pervades societies around the world economy, and world politics. In the end, neoliberalism comes to say that if you don't have a job, start a business, make a future for yourself, as if the social system in which we live were aseptic, and always treated the hard-working person fairly, as if the economic system had no influence on your chances of work, of success, when the reality is that the economic structures are constructed in such a way that they only benefit big capital. And so, although they tell you to undertake, to build your future, that you live in a society of opportunities and that you can succeed, the reality is that very few manage to succeed, as they say, unless they have the backing of large amounts of capital. Why? Because the economic structures in which we live and on which we are dependent, interdependent, are structures that only benefit a very small percentage of society, the richest. In the final analysis, this neoliberal approach, this unbridled capitalism, based on unfettered competition and rugged individualism, has nothing to do with interdependence, which is how systems work, how systems survive and thrive. This is why, operating outside the laws of systems, our current social and economic system will have no future but to collapse, because it does not work as systems should work. Could we now get into the "tell me how you see the world and I'll tell you what you have done with it"? Let's start with the question, what have we done with the world? From this view of reality based on competition and individualism. We don't have time to go through the data, but you can find a lot of it on the internet. First, we can affirm that in the 40 years of neoliberalism, the greatest destruction of nature of all time has taken place, and the greatest social imbalances of all time have followed. As Dr. Emily Wilson, professor of classical studies at the University of Pennsylvania, points out, in the US, the top 1% controls about 40% of the wealth. In the Roman Empire, a slave-owning, militaristic, undemocratic colonial power, which was the closest thing before the modern era to a globalized society, the top 1% of the Roman population probably controlled only about 16% of the empire's riches. With neoliberalism, there has been a brutal concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, the 1% of the world's population, while the rest of the people became poorer and poorer. In fact, the middle classes have almost become extinct, while a new and massive social class has appeared, the precariat, made up of those people who, even with a job, do not have enough to make a living and pay the minimum monthly expenses. But following the cascade of consequences we saw in Yellowstone, what has this unfair and unbalanced social system brought about? It has brought about massive unrest among working populations, leading to a rise of populisms, mainly of a fascist nature. And with the rise of fascist populisms, meaning Trump, Putin, Bolsonaro, Orban and others in Europe and the rest of the world, has come the massive manipulation of public opinion through fake news and conspiracy theories, news and ideas that only seek to generate fear, because if you are afraid, it will be easier that you accept an authoritarian leader. And so we are witnessing the destruction of the foundation of democracy. This is what we are seeing in the United States, which is in serious risk of dissolution, with a country totally polarized by the rise of Donald Trump's fascism. And it is what we are seeing in so many countries, where fascist populisms have instilled fear with their fake news and conspiracies, producing a social polarization that threatens to bring about the collapse of these countries. And if we look at everything from a global perspective, the picture is not more hopeful. Here we find that the countries of the Global South, Latin America, Africa, and South Asian countries are not only in the hands of the northern rich countries through unfair financial debt, but they are also in the hands of big corporations. An example of them is Chile, as we have said before, the first neoliberal experiment, which led to the fact that all the waters of the country's rivers are now in private hands, in the hands of big corporations, something as basic as water, all privatized. This is a disaster and will continue to go towards collapse as long as the social system does not accept an approach based on interdependencies, approaches such as circular economies or the economy of the common good, because contrary to what Margaret Thatcher said, there are economic and social alternatives to neoliberalism. But we will talk about this another day, later on. So, in view of the importance of interdependencies within systems, be they natural, chemical, biological, social, or whatever kind of systems, it should come as no surprise after what we have been talking about in this program in previous weeks, what is stated in one of those myths of the future that we have been talking about in the last few programs. Here we talk about the legend of the Rainbow Warriors, but there are other myths of the future that match this one, such as the legend of the Warriors of Shambhala, a Tibetan myth where, interestingly, the concept of interdependence appears as a crucial concept for overcoming disaster. We have a version here, which you can also find in the Earth Stories collection. You can download it from there, go to the credits of this episode. A version of the legend passed on by Joanna Macy, a writer and environmental activist, a scholar in Buddhist studies, systems theories, and deep ecology. Joanna Macy is a highly respected person in these circles of environmental activism and deep ecology. She did her doctoral thesis with Erwin Laszlo, which is a very prominent philosopher of science and systems theorist. She was also learning with a Tibetan Lama, Drugul Choegyal Rinpoche, who taught her a fragment of the Kalachakra Tantra, one of the sacred texts of Tibetan Buddhism. In that legend, there is a section where Drugul Choegyal Rinpoche, speaking of the Shambhala warriors, tells Joanna Macy, "They train in the use of two weapons," and actually he did say the word weapons. So I think you may prefer to say tools, instruments, or resources. That is what he said. "What are they?" I asked, says Joanna Macy. And he held up his hands in the way the lamas use them to hold the ritual objects and in the great dances of his people. And he said, "One is compassion, and the other is insight into the radical interdependence of all phenomena. And you need both. One is not enough. You need the compassion because that provides the fuel to move you out to where you need to go, to do what you need to do. And what it boils down to is not being afraid of the suffering of our world. If you are not afraid of the pain, then nothing can stop you, you know? But by itself, that is too hot to handle. It can burn you out. So you need the other. You need that insight into the radical interexistence of all things. With that, you know that this is not a battle between the good guys and the bad guys, because the line between good and evil runs through the landscape of every human heart. We are so interwoven in the web of existence that even the smallest act with clear intention has repercussions through the web that you can't begin to see, let alone measure. Such a worldview that recognizes interdependencies is therefore crucial if we are to emerge from the crisis in which we find ourselves. As I have already noted, we can find this myth of the future, the legend of the Warriors of Shambhala, in the Earth Stories collection, at the link in the credits of this program. However, we will be telling this story in full length shortly. Do you work in education, storytelling, communication, or social work? We invite you to discover the Earth Stories collection. The Earth Stories collection is a global bank of myths, legends, and folk tales capable of transforming the worldview of societies for the development of a more just, peaceful, and sustainable civilization. These traditional stories, belonging to cultures all over the world, are free to access and download at theearthstoriescollection.org. The Earth Stories Collection, a global bank of educational resources for the construction of another possible world. Today's program has got out of control. it has been a bit long. Let's hope you didn't find it too long to listen to. Today we have talked about the individualism, which is part of the modernist worldview that pervades our civilization. This individualism that portrays us as independent individuals when the reality is quite different. Current science is telling us, through systems theories and the theory of complexity, that we are not independent individuals, but interdependent, that somehow we are all in the same boat and we depend on all the beings that inhabit this planet, that we depend on each other. Secondly, we have discussed how this concept of interdependence is already included in the Earth Charter as a fundamental concept of this most inclusive international document ever developed. To explain the idea of interdependence, we first talked about interconnections. We told you a traditional Indian Buddhist story, the Indra's net, which already spoke of the interdependence of everything that exists. And we have given two examples, that of the extermination of the sparrows in China between 1958 and 1960, which was a disaster because it caused, as we have said, a huge famine in the country, and that of the extermination of the wolves in the Yellowstone region in the United States, and what their extermination and later their reintroduction into the area meant. Here we have been able to see how interdependence works in natural systems. And finally, we have also been seeing what happens when interdependence in social systems is not respected, which is what has been happening during the last 40 years of neoliberalism, which has led us to the phase of greatest destruction, both social and environmental, on our planet. All of this we have seen through good today. And we hope that you are aware that simply by changing your worldview, you not only begin to understand what is going on in the world around you, but you can also change the way you are in it, and you can achieve greater degrees of satisfaction in life. If you change your worldview and bring it in line with the way the world really works, you will achieve many benefits in your life.
In a world facing an uncharted future because of the planetary emergency we are now entering, we need voices to help sow the radical hope that we can build an alternative tomorrow. Become a patron, and for $1 a month, join our tribe. Find us on Patreon as Midnight Sun.
It is time to say goodbye at Midnight Sun. We say goodbye in a hurry because we have gone too long. Thank you for listening to us and for supporting this radio space. For the rest, we have to thank Kim Robertson for generously and royalty-free offering us his Green Sleeves tune on the Celtic harp. Thanks to John Mario Diaz and Radio Chacaruna for being the first independent radio station to broadcast this program. Thanks to Blake Kendall for giving his voice to the program. Thanks to Marta Ventura for being at the controls of the whole Midnight Sun network, which is just beginning, but we don't know where it will lead us. And finally, I want to call you once again to action, to call you to be part of Rainbow Warriors 3.5, this social movement or campaign or whatever you want we call it, where the only thing we propose is that you put your talents at the service of the earth and the earth community of life. As you know, we need to bring together 3.5% of the world's population to prevent disaster. And we can do it. We can do it. We are radically hopeful that we will. Join the tribe of all colors of Midnight Sun and Rainbow Warriors 3.5. And that's all. Just have good weeks. You will hear from us again in a couple of weeks. We can't do the program weekly now, so it will have to be in 2 weeks' time. We will talk about imagination as a way of looking at interdependencies and interconnections in systems. There is nothing more. May the sun shine on all of you at midnight.
To avoid the social collapse we are heading towards because of the climate and extinction emergency, we are going to need 3.5% of the population to take action. That means we need help. Lots of help. If you have an independent radio station and want to share Midnight Sun's radio programs on it, find out more at midnightsun.com.es/broadcasting. Midnight Sun, the social media hub of the Rainbow Warriors 3.5 global campaign.
Midnight Sun, el sol de medianoche.